With effort, Bridie unlocks the cabinet in the parlor, unwraps the winter mermaid, and pushes her onto a shelf. Now there are 3 specimens in a row, all very different. To the left of the mermaid, a common dormouse with the look of something a cat had good sport with, Bridie's own apprentice piece. To the right of the mermaid, a human heart, its intricate workings splayed and open to the eye, prepared by Dr. John Ames. Each of these specimens speaks of moments long gone, when these perishable scraps were examined, chosen, and meticulously preserved. They disturb the natural order of things. Life, death, dust. Here is time held in suspension. Yesterday pickled. Eternity in a jar. That was a short excerpt from the book Things in Jars by Jess Kidd, which is a book from my collection that has been sitting on my bedside table for multiple years now. So good thing I finally read it. I can't exactly remember when I bought it. I think it was sometime in between me graduating from college, which would be pre-COVID, and then me moving out of my parents' house, which would be post-COVID. So between 2019 2020. I probably should have looked up the publishing year and then I would have known, because what I do remember is that this book was in the new release section at Barnes & Noble when I saw it. And I remember looking at the cover, or just seeing the cover from a distance and being drawn in, because it's very bright blue. It's very pretty to look at. The snails on it are iridescent looking, which those are the little gold dots, if you can't tell, in the reference picture. I did not pick up that those were snails for a really long time. There's also a fishtail, which if you look on the other side of the cover, which I can't show here, or I guess I could, I just don't have that image, you'll see is actually a mermaid. And if you look into the inside flap, it describes that this is a mystery book that takes place in Victorian England, which were nicking some boxes for me. And then lastly, if you're looking at the front, which you can see, there is a quote that is pulled from a review by Diane Setterfield, who, if you listen to the last episode, would know is one of the authors I greatly like. Her book, The 13th Tale, is probably in my top 10 favorite books that I have read in my life thus far. And I mean, just all of those things combined compelled me to buy this book. Hardcover, brand new, at Barnes & Noble fancy smancy bookstore. So I was excited to read this book in a lot of ways. I took forever to read it because, life for one, and just being burnout from reading, which I talked about in episode 1 with my history of reading and my relationship with it. And I think that there are lots of ways in which, at least in the past however many years since graduating college, reading has kind of been, when I have read, something that's kind of like a comfort thing. And so I like reading books that I've already read, and this just kind of got thrown to the wayside. Plus it got under some books by which my mother had lent me, and I've already read one of those books and done an episode on it. But, I figured I might as well get ahead and read this one. So, this book is chiefly seen through the perspective of Bridie Devine, who is described as, in her 30s, and a widow who wears this really ugly widow's cap. They can't get over that description in this book, no matter who's describing her. But Bridie is essentially a private investigator / happens to know a lot of things that you wouldn't expect a woman in Victorian England to know. And you learn why as the book progresses. You come across a couple other interesting characters, which I will describe as we embark here. So at the start, she's in a cemetery. I don't remember a whole lot about why. I think it's related to another case. And she runs into Ruby Doyle, who is essentially her sidekick, for lack of a better word. And Ruby Doyle is where we start to talk about some spiritualism in Victorian England, because Ruby is a ghost. Basically, when they meet, she sees that he has a tombstone. It's been said already that he's dead, like in papers. And she basically is like, well, I can see you and no one else can see you, but I don't believe in ghosts. So I am just going to accept that you are somehow in front of me. And that is an interesting dynamic that starts this book off to just weird things. The dynamic between Ruby and Bridie, in a lot of ways, weirds me out by the end. And part of it is that I think you could say because they have a prior relationship, and that is a mini mystery within the mystery, because Bridie doesn't recognize him, but Ruby is like, oh no, we know each other, and I'm not going to tell you how. And that is resolved by the end of the book, and I guess it's given to, like, some idea of, like, getting spiritual peace and moving on into whatever happens after death from a Victorian perspective. I mean, like, maybe not really a Victorian perspective, but it's very tied into things that come out of, like, the spiritualist ideas that got really prevalent with Victorian England in parts of higher society, and with seances, which that doesn't happen in the book. It isn't something that is, like, expanded much farther, but, I mean, you kind of just have to accept pretty quickly on that most of what happens is also seen by this ghost character that nobody else can see. And my only other reasoning for why he's there is that he provides some kind of comedic relief in a lot of ways. Just because Bridie will react to him when other people are around at times. Sometimes I think it's a little too much and it's not commented on, unless I misread something, which is quite possible. But I think by the end of the book, sometimes it gets forgotten that other people are in the room. After running into Ruby Doyle and him following her to her home/practice, Bridie is approached by a Dr. Harbin, who is there at the bequest of his quasi-employer, I guess, his primary patient / like family that he looks at, which is a Sir Edmund, who I believe is a baron. And Dr. Harbin is there to request that Bridie comes to investigate the apparent kidnapping of Sir Edmund's daughter, Christabel. And that is the primary mystery of the book in terms of how we think of mysteries with whodunits. I will not call it the primary mystery of the book in all actuality, for a reason I'll bring up later. But what we learn just from what Dr. Harbin says is that Sir Edmund kind of wants to keep this on the down low. He doesn't want the British police to investigate. He kind of wants to handle things in-house. And that raises some flags that, I mean, Bridie doesn't come out and say, but, like, you can tell there's some thoughts that happen here. And all that is really expressed is there is something very unusual about the child, Christabel. What we do learn as it kind of progresses where Bridie starts to investigate, especially when she goes to Sir Edmund's home, is that Christabel was kept in a part of the house that literally about nobody could go into, except for Dr. Harbin, his daughter, who's about Christabel's age, and the nursemaid, who we learn is not been around very long, and the previous nursemaid sounds to have died under suspicious circumstances. Not to mention that Sir Edmund's late wife also seems to have died under suspicious circumstances. So there's just lots of suspicious things getting thrown around. And we learn that Sir Edmund is very interested in aquatic life, that he has an interest in the unusual, which becomes, we'll talk about, like a major theme. And as the book progresses, it is very much implied that this is all connected to each other and very connected to the child Christabel as well. The other character who I did mention is the nursemaid is Mrs. Bibby, and she is a prominent character talked about, and also like in terms of points of view, because we get her point of view a fair bit within the book. So, I mean, that kind of rounds out our primary cast of characters. There are plenty of other characters. There's servants, there are people that get visited for like one scene to learn some more information or to talk about information that we have learned and sort out things. And I mean, it very much starts to come down to like this collection of oddities, which gets into the themes. Oddities is a big one. The excerpt I read is talking about literal, like, preserved in formaldehyde, like, hearts, and a dormouse, and then, of course, there is what it's called as the winter mermaid. And the winter mermaid is essentially what appears to be a baby mermaid in a jar. And, I mean, that wraps into like that whole aquatic thing going down, and the Winter Mermaid is kind of essential to part of what happens with the mystery and what some of the explanations are. We also see characters that embody oddity, like besides Ruby being a ghost, and you could call that an oddity even though that's more in the spiritualist realm than, you know, things that we look at to go, how did this happen? There's characters that embody this. Bridie has I don't want to call her a servant, but essentially she's like Bridie's housekeeper, and her name is Cora. And Cora is described as essentially a giant woman who is so giant that she gives off qualities of a man, so people don't 100% like recognize if she's a woman or not. And we get like a brief glimpse of her backstory, and the sense is that Bridie essentially rescued her from a freak show at a circus where she was kept for people to gawk at and, I mean, just express that they don't understand how these people that are so different can happen. And I mean, there's a lot which kind of goes into something else that I put as a containing life. And I think, like, really, when you look at those two themes together, it's about why do we take these things that just don't happen once or twice, or even if they happen once or twice, we say anomalies, right? Why do we look at anomalies and just want to look at them, like, no matter what type of looking at them it is? Why do we have that response? And I think that there's something to be said about, you know, the bad sides of that too, which we, I think, have more of a conversation about today, especially in how we deal with people that are different than us. And to have that conversation in Victorian England is really hard because, I mean, that was the time where, like, freak shows are a big deal. I mean, we have Barnum and Bailey in the US. I think that's about the same time. And you just kind of go, like, why did they have the idea to take these things, or, like, not even things, we really shouldn't say things, take these people that somehow had something that made them different from other people, and it seems like something that shouldn't have been able to happen. And why do we want to contain them for everyone else's entertainment? Because there's something that's grossly wrong about that, but it also speaks to human curiosity, it speaks to human nature, and I mean, there's lots of things that I think are kind of complex, and I don't know that I can fully break that down here in this type of format. Another thing that is probably a pretty big theme is trying to figure out how do we interact with the supernatural and the fantastical. Obviously, we have Ruby, he's a ghost. The other thing being that the true mystery of this book is trying to answer what is it that makes Christabel so unique and so special that the normal authority route is not who you want to talk to. And I mean, it does come up that very likely Christabel is trafficked, essentially. And she's trafficked for whatever characteristic it is that has labeled her an oddity. And obviously, too, like with the aquatic stuff, and there's already, like, mermaid themes, there's things that point that Christabel is somehow connected to mermaids. And I mean, that's where you start to bring in, you know, the fantastical element, which is, you know, even bringing into questions of how much of fantasy isn't really fantasy because it came from somewhere, you know, and how much of it is things that we don't know as much about because we don't interact with it correctly. I think that is a question that does get raised in the subtext of this book, which, I mean, again, it's an interesting thing to think about, but it's not, I would say that's probably not as prevalent as the whole, like, oddities containing of life, wanting to just look at people that are different than you, because it's just not something that you have, like, a way to grasp and relate to. My overall opinion of this book, I don't think it's a bad book. I gave it like a 3 out of 5, and I think the reason I did that was because I had higher expectations, I want to say, especially with the Diane Setterfield backing, and just everything that was advertised me, like, checked so much. But what fell flat to me was the writing would sometimes feel a little choppy to me, which, I mean, I'm not gonna knock. I think a lot of people write choppily. But there was just something that just felt like you'd read one sentence and then you'd read the next and there wasn't something like connecting the two. And I needed that for some reason in some of those moments. There's also a lot of going back and forth between points of view, which isn't bad. I like going back and forth with points of view when it adds something. I don't know how much it added a whole lot of. I think we could have done more, especially because sometimes it's not just going back and forth between points of view. It's also going back between periods of time. So, like, we get maybe we get Bridie's point of view, and then we get Mrs. Bibby, who I said we get a bit of her point of view as well. And then sometimes Mrs. Bibby is telling a story that is very obviously her childhood. And then sometimes we'll go and suddenly, like, we'll finish a chapter and the next page will be maybe like roughly the same time but 20 years earlier, and it's Bridie's childhood. And the reason I can tell that we're doing that is Bridie's childhood becomes very woven and ingrained into the story and the mystery. And there's connections with people that this feels like it is very much Bridie's story as much as it is a mystery. And there's things I enjoy about that. It's just, it does also take you out of what's happening a little bit. Another thing about this is that as a mystery, as I said, it is very much more about why is Christabel odd than it is about the whodunit, which is what you were supposed to, in my mind, get hooked by. Essentially, you learn who did it by chapter 2. I mean, maybe it is chapter 3, but you get the idea. You learn who it is very quick. Bridie kind of also decides who it is pretty quick, and she's correct. But a lot of it, in that side of it, just does not hit right. And I think it is because I like whodunits. I like things that, you know, you collect clues and you figure out who did it that way. But again, like, as I said, the focus of this book is about the oddities, which goes with the whole, why is Christabel so unique? Which, I mean, even that isn't really answered by the end of the book. It is very implied with all the imagery, even by the front cover. It just is never, like, I don't know. I wouldn't say it. It just doesn't feel confirmed. The ending does give you it gives you a confirmation without saying it, if you get what I mean. But I mean, it does give me kind of like a sense with a lack of suspense, and that isn't something I totally love. But I mean, it wasn't a bad book, and maybe that's part of why I would give it a 3 out of 5. Because to me, 3 isn't bad. 3 is like, you know, I read this book and I liked it. I didn't love it, but I didn't hate it. If I hated it, I would have given it like a 1, and that is not what happened. So, anyways, I am working on reading, and this will probably take me forever if I'm being honest, The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, which is another mystery novel, but it does involve romance, and it is a book that is a classic in a lot of ways. So I'm excited to get through that. It's been on my list for a while. So I will catch you guys next time that I'm ready to record, and I hope that you have a good rest of whatever time of day it is for you. Bye.